Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome David Rockefeller to introduce our next session. David is the director of Rockefeller Capital Management and former chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation. David and Susan have been valuable, true friends of the College of the Atlantic for many, many years and valuable advisors to the Summer Institute since its inception. Truly, the Rockefellers have helped make College of the Atlantic what it is today. Thank you, David, for being here.
Thank you, Sylvia, and congratulations on hitting the ground running. This is wonderful leadership. Good morning, everyone. My name is David Rockefeller Jr., and welcome to the fifth session of the COA Summer Institute. Title is Questions of Democracy, as I hope you all know. We are so grateful to have Rajiv Shah on the College of the Atlantic campus. His career in the public, private, and philanthropic sectors has already been inspiring and, more important, consequential. It was my honor, in fact, and a pleasure to overlap with Raj on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. He is an inspiration himself and a great leader. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation about Raj's work and career, as well as his insights into how we achieve transformational change. Today, we'll hear him explain, I hope, what is a big bet mindset and how do we move from vision to reality. Leading us through this conversation is Ambassador Phil Lader. Phil is the former U.S. Ambassador to the Court of St. James, chairman of WPP PLC, which includes J. Walter Thompson, Ogilvy and Mather, Young and Rubicam, and other companies, with over 200,000 associates in 114 countries. He is also a former university president and was a member of President Clinton's cabinet. But that's not all. He is a senior advisor to Morgan Stanley, lead director of AMC Entertainment, and a trustee director of Rand Corporation and several other privately held companies and foundations. He has been awarded honorary doctorates, however, by only 14 universities. Please welcome Phil and Rajiv. Thanks very much.
Raj, if you don't understand this, if only my grandfather would have heard that, because he was hired by the Rockefeller family with several hundred other Italian immigrants to lay the marble at Rockefeller Center. Only in America. Thank you, David. Didn't we have an extraordinary privilege this morning in that conversation with Bill and Joe? It's just a brilliant job. Thank you guys for doing that for us. But their role was diagnostic, trying to focus on what's perhaps right, but also what's wrong, what's endangering democracy. And what Raj and I thought would be more appropriate at this session in response to what we heard this morning is to try to be a bit more prescriptive. And the playbook, in the views of as range people like Sean Penn and Ben Affleck, the actor activists, or Tony Blair, or the NBA commissioner, Adam Silver, is this book, Big Bets: How Large-Scale Change Really Happens, by Rajiv Shah. I have to tell you, without any exaggeration, there are very few Americans who have met with and worked with world leaders to the extent that Raj Shah has. And I would say that I know of no one in his generation in this country who has had, as you said, David, a consequential impact, essentially, in a variety of world affairs. So I may seem to be exaggerating, but let me give you just a little bit more bio information about why I say this. Linda and I were privileged to meet Rajiv and his equally impactful and impressive spouse, Shivam, 25 years ago. They were graduate students. We've been friends and shared a variety of experiences over these now 3 decades. But I start this discussion of democracy and I hope you don't take offense, by reference to what I think is the most anti-democratic institution in America, the most anti-democratic, and that is the family. None of us think that our children should have an equal voice in our decisions, right? But imagine, and here I really risk offense, imagine how anti-democratic an Indian American immigrant family must have been. And so the pressure on him to become an engineer or a doctor, and perhaps the weight of responsibility that he has had subconsciously or consciously to take advantage of the opportunities that his parents and their courage provided, I think has shaped this career. And I want to hit a couple of the bullet points before we get into the discussion, so you understand why I don't exaggerate in the things that I've been saying about him. He grew up in this middle-class family in Detroit. His father was an engineer, fine education. He worked for Ford Motor Company. He had the responsibility for developing some of the equipment used in the Apollo mission, if you will. His mother was a Montessori school teacher. She ran a Montessori school for a period of time. So he went to the University of Michigan and then London School of Economics, where he fell in love with his spouse of all these years. And then, of course, the pressure from home, he went to medical school, University of Pennsylvania Medical School. But his real interest was his sidelight doing the additional consequential degree in public health and economics. And so from that, he immediately got involved in a political campaign, working for Al Gore. And through a series of coincidences, he went to work for the Gates Foundation. Now, I'm going to really fast forward to tell you, here's this young fellow at the Gates Foundation, and he moves on relatively quickly. In 2000, Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, asks him to serve, and he's appointed the Undersecretary of Agriculture for International and Scientific and Developmental Affairs. But he didn't last in that job for more than 6 months, because at the age of 30, Hillary Clinton called him and said, I want you to join the foreign policy team and to be the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Here's this 30-year-old fellow now leading an international organization with 8,000 employees, operations in 100 countries. And its principal purpose, and here's the relevance for our conversation today, is the support and the expansion of democracy around the world. I fast forward, and as David said, he subsequently becomes president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Rockefeller Foundation, if I'm correct, $8 billion of assets in its endowment. Gifts and programs and charities that he oversees of $500 to $700 million a year. And here he is, having done that now over this last decade, and he's just turned 50 years old. So I say all this because I want to ask you first to say anything you want for a few minutes, and then I want to kind of take a different approach in the conversation we have in a prescriptive way of what is being done, what has been done that you've experienced or led, affecting and expanding democracy, and perhaps what we might do. So it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Phil. It's a real treat to be with all of you here. So thank you for having me at the College of the Atlantic. I want to say Phil and Linda later, who's also here, have been great friends for a long time, role models, and people that when I think of what does a model public servant and American citizen look like, it's Phil and Linda. So we're really honored to be here with you, Phil, and thank you for hosting. It's hard to be on Mount Desert Island in Maine and say anything about the Rockefeller family or David and Susan Rockefeller that could be additive to what you already know. But obviously the legacy of David and his family and the work of all of the foundations affiliated with the family have been transformational, not just for this area, but for the world. And it's a real honor to be a part of that institution today. What I thought I might do is just open well, first I'll just say why I wanted to be a part of a conversation about democracy. At the end of the day, I believe democracy only persists and succeeds if it delivers for people. And when I have been in settings where I've seen war, conflict, famine, even worse, and when what we might call democracy does not deliver, basic dignity, basic opportunity, basic human rights for women and girls, for young boys, for families and communities, whether that's here in the center part of our country in the United States, or whether it's in Somalia or northern India, democracy falters and people lose faith in their ability to aspire to more. And so I wrote the book Big Bets because I felt so much of our political dialogue is about debating things on the margins. You know, should the tax rate in a particular bracket be 22.8 or 23.6? And then we fight vehemently about those marginal differences. Should we take 3% of American school kids and put them in charter schools and give them choice or not? And we fight aggressively about these tiny little transformations. And sometimes they happen, sometimes they don't. I feel like I get to be a part of an institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, that actually 111 years ago started to think very differently about social change. And back then, actually, there was a big fire in Dayton, Ohio. It wiped out a YMCA. And the trustees of the Rockefeller Foundation, a newly created entity 111 years ago, received a proposal to rebuild that YMCA. And John D. Rockefeller Sr. and his partner in the foundation's endeavor, Frederick Gates, wrote these letters back and forth with each other, debating what to do, and ultimately concluded that the foundation shouldn't actually provide short-term immediate relief services wherever there's need, but rather should reserve its capital and its capacity to bring people together and its intellectual capability for doing big transformational things that could change the face of humanity. And that aspiration they called scientific philanthropy. And it led to literally bringing science into modern health and public health and modern medicine, creating medical schools, public health institutions like the CDC and the World Health Organization, inventing vaccines, won a Nobel Prize for that effort. 40 years later, it led to bringing science to agriculture, especially in Asia and Latin America, and places where hundreds of millions of people were on the brink of hunger and starvation. And their effort was so successful, called the Green Revolution, that it won the Nobel Peace Prize for a foundation scientist named Dr. Norman Borlaug. And today, we do a lot of different things, but on that scale, we're investing billions of dollars in actually aggregating tens of billions from others to help bring a sustainable and just energy transition to developing economies and to our own country here in the United States. Because we believe if we do not make the shift, and I say this as the president of an institution created with Standard Oil's wealth originally, but if we do not make the shift from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable one, we simply will not survive as a planet. We simply will see billions of people pushed back into poverty, strife, migration, and suffering, that we are behind every metric as a globe that we need to be to achieve certainly 1.5 degrees, but even 2 degrees warming as the top line. We're probably going to blow through both of those numbers at the cost of human welfare for billions of people. And we're working aggressively, and I'm happy to talk more about it as we go into the conversation, to bring renewable electrification, in particular to the 2 to 3 billion people that live in fundamentally energy-constrained settings and environments all around the world. So when you get to learn about this history and about how people brought science and innovation together with the capacity to build partnerships, public-private, Democratic, Republican, religious, atheist, everybody in the same room actually solving problems, and then a business-like discipline around measuring results, sticking with things for sometimes decades until we succeeded. Those 3 elements, innovation, partnership, and the sticking with things until we deliver results, that's what we call big bets. It's what they called scientific philanthropy, but my editors didn't like that term for the book title. And I feel like I've gotten to see that mindset at work, fighting pandemics with President Obama when I was in government, fighting for children to survive and thrive beyond the age of 5 by expanding the reach of vaccination when I worked with Bill and Melinda Gates, and now today at the Rockefeller Foundation.
Yeah. Since we thought that we should try to be prescriptive about things that you've experienced or led that have had an enormous impact in the expansion of democracy or preservation of democracy, I'd like to have a few snapshots of a few moments and ask you to summarize a lengthy talk that you could give. And the first that strikes me is how on an overnight airplane trip to Europe, on the back of a napkin, you and one colleague penciled out something that was a daring idea that led to something with global impact. So the scene that I set for you is that here you are in Paris, sitting in an ornate building in a gold gilt chair. There's a vase in front of you with these hot pink roses. And to your right, there's one of the only two other people in the room, Bill Gates, the wealthiest man in the world. And in front of you is Jacques Chirac. What the hell were you doing there?
Well, I asked myself that question the entire time.
Also, you were 30 years old.
I was young. Oh,
This was before 30.
Yeah, this was early.
Yeah.
And basically, when I started with Bill and Melinda, they had picked up an older Rockefeller project called the Children's Vaccine Program and invested $750 million in that effort and turned it into something called the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. And the basic idea was, if you looked around the world, there are about 104 million kids born every year. Less than half of those kids were getting vaccinated. And as a result, about 11.5 million children every year would die under the age of 5. And we did a lot of math, and I have almost 2 chapters dedicated to the analytics we did that basically showed investing in safe, effective vaccines for those kids who weren't receiving them, whether they were in Bihar in India or South Africa or parts of Latin America, would in fact save their lives in the most cost-effective way. So we'd been doing some work on this for a couple of years, and we just ran into a big problem. And the problem was there was no real vaccine industry that was high volume and low cost that could provide enough supply to reach 70 countries and the 40, 50 million kids in those countries on an annual basis with product. And the financing system to procure those vaccines basically was non-existent. So you're right, on the back of a napkin, actually at a bar in an old castle in Wilton Park in the UK, a colleague of mine and I kind of sketched out, together with the chief advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, then Gordon Brown of the UK, sketched out an idea for what we called, what has now been called a social impact bond. And the idea was, if we could go ahead and vaccinate the kids, we could sell a bond to investors and only ask for bond repayment backed by country governments if in fact we could demonstrate we successfully vaccinated those kids and saved those lives. And it was a controversial project for a lot of reasons. It was a very innovative financial structure, but it required rules changes and accounting changes and governments to come along. So anyway, we had, Gordon told us, if you can get the French to do it, and Sarkozy was the finance minister at the time, and Chirac was the president, I'll make this happen with the rest of Europe. So Bill and I were sitting there making our case. And I was nervous out of my mind, as you'd imagine, because I had basically designed this project and didn't quite expect that this would be the moment that was either a go or a no-go. But we had an outstanding 60-minute meeting. I marveled at the fact that the richest person in the world spent 58 of those 60 minutes in a discussion about how to immunize poor children. The fourth person in the room was the CEO of Microsoft Europe, who came along and said, we didn't even talk about my issues. And President Chirac directed Sarkozy to do this project with us. The bottom line is we issued the world's first social impact bond at the time, but this was 2005 or 6, it was actually issued. It sold in the markets, raised about $6 billion for vaccines. It allowed us to build a global vaccine supply base for these kids. And 19 years later, 1 billion children have been vaccinated and 20 million child lives have been saved.
You can understand from that this doctor, essentially, this physician, knows a little bit about finance as well. So it's no surprise he's today on the board of the New York Federal Reserve Board as well. But let me go ahead and give another snapshot. Let's say now you've reached the much more mature age of 36. You're the head of USAID, and you're walking into the Oval Office. And there, looking out the window behind the resolute desk, is President Obama and Vice President Biden. And what do you overhear then Vice President Biden saying about you as you enter the room?
Well, Phil, so I started running USAID in about a week before the Haiti earthquake of 2010. And that earthquake, in a moment, caused the largest humanitarian catastrophe we had ever experienced.
Took 220,000 lives.
220,000 lives, 21 of 22 ministries, including the United Nations building, which was the UN was providing security in Haiti, had collapsed. And a lot of the leadership of the UN, as well as the Haitian government, perished in the rubble. And in that moment, you know, there was the fog of war. Like, we just didn't know how we could be helpful and what we could do. But the president had directed an extraordinary response. And he called me the night before to say, Raj, you're going to be in charge of this response, civilian and military, and no expenses spared. This is our moment to show the world that American power can be used for good. And this is a country 2 hours from our shores and a moral calling we have to live up to. So the next day, I was up all night, you know, working with my teams, and stayed in the office, as did everyone at USAID that evening.
But you were supposed to be leading this.
But I was supposed to be leading it. So I was supposed to brief the president on where we were the next morning. And so I walked into the Oval, as you mentioned. And back then we had BlackBerries, so we put the BlackBerry away. You know this well, in the little compartment. And I walked in the door, and Obama was sort of looking at me, but Biden was looking out the window, as you said. And they were very close to each other on the other end of the room. And I walk in and I hear Biden saying, "Are you sure about putting this Raj Shah guy in charge of this?" He said, this is what he said. He said he's like 30 something. He's new to town. And Craig Fugate, who ran FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is much more experienced at running emergency responses, all of which is true. Like, he didn't say anything wasn't true.
And Admiral Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, would be reporting to you in this effort.
Exactly, exactly. And so we all gather. So anyway, I walk in, and Obama sees me walk in, and he's like, "Raj, come in." You know, he like walks away. But I had heard what I had heard, and I was pretty anxious. But within about a minute, almost everybody piled in. We sat on the sofas. We had our briefing. It went well. On the way out of the room, I grabbed Craig, and I said, "Craig, I need your help." And Craig said, "You know, I'll do anything I can." And the next 3 months, but really the next 3 weeks, but over the next window of time, he actually worked out of our office with me, hand in glove. And one of the things we did really effectively in that response, which was the largest humanitarian response America's ever mounted to a catastrophe, 22,000 limb reattachment surgeries. We had something called the USS Comfort, the hospital ship deployed in Haiti. We fed 70% of the population. We had the diarrheal disease rate was lower 6 months after than it was the day before the earthquake because of the water and sanitation work. And it was intense and it was difficult, but it was, by the metrics we measured, the best we could do. It happened because Craig was helpful. It happened because Admiral Mullen did the same thing. He said, "Raj, we're all in to help." And what I learned was, you know, Washington can be a place where people are obsessed with power and silos and who's in control of what. But if you ask for help and you look like you need it, which I must have, everybody in that moment was extremely supportive and extremely kind. And Craig, front of the list. So that,
Well, briefly,
went on.
that just gave you more impossible tasks. So you're now, let's say, in the Situation Room, and the Ebola outbreak is threatening Africa, but about to hit the United States. What did you have to do with all that?
Well, we ran the Ebola response in West Africa. And if you remember in 2014, during the Ebola crisis, the Centers for Disease Control had projected that there would be 1.4 million cases of Ebola worldwide and a few 100,000 in the United States. Now everybody's a pandemic expert, but back then it was new to folks. And just to put it in perspective, since we all have lived through COVID together, back then when they made those projections, there was a 70% mortality rate for catching Ebola. Anyone who got it, a hemorrhagic fever where you bleed to death internally and visually, would pass. And so, and we didn't really have a playbook for how to respond. And so in that moment, President Obama made his big bet, which I got to be a part of, which was for the first time in American history to deploy 3,200 troops for a mission around fighting a disease into West Africa. And you can imagine when we did this, we were all terrified that should any one member of the US military or any one American aid worker lose their life in this endeavor in a highly politically charged effort 3 weeks before the midterm elections, it would have been an absolute crisis. And so the good news is through a lot of investment in laboratory capacity and a real focus on data systems and bringing a lot of ability to listen to those local people, especially young girls and women who were washing and redressing and hugging and kissing and honoring the bodies of the deceased, which was where most of the transmission was happening. By changing those practices, we were able to get it down to only 30,000 cases, only 11,000 deaths, only 2 cases on American land. And in fact, neither of those were transmitted or caught on US soil. So, and of course, in February, when we brought all of our troops home, every single one of them was safe and sound.
I fast forward, you're now the 13th president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and the principal legacy in most people's minds of the Rockefeller Foundation is the extraordinary influence in public health globally. Few people understand the World Health Organization in many ways is an outgrowth of the Rockefeller Foundation, if you will. And yet, soon after you get the job, you go down to New Orleans, concerned about what's happening with Katrina, and you get together with the mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu. He mentioned something that gives you an idea that is highly unlikely that the Rockefeller Foundation ever would have been involved in, and probably is not one of the most significant, but in terms of a view of democracy and a view of the role of a philanthropic organization, I think everyone would be interested. What grew out of your conversation with Mitch at that time?
Well, Phil, I just started and the foundation had been involved through my predecessor, a wonderful leader named Judith Roden, and under David's stewardship in really helping to rebuild New Orleans and rebuild it using modern principles of resilience and inclusion and social engagement. And they did an extraordinary job. So I was going to see a foundation success story, and that was my expectation. And it was extraordinary to see what they had accomplished over a decade of post-Katrina support to the city. What I saw instead was I landed right after there had been a car bombing of a contractor that Mitch Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans, had hired to take down Confederate statues, including one of Robert E. Lee that stood sort of in the middle of one of the main circles in town. And it turns out Mitch had done probably 3 years of work engaging with communities and community leaders and explaining and in a shared way, learning in a very democratic civic process about these statues. One honored a terrorist attack against the integrated police force of New Orleans. And it was conducted by a predecessor of the KKK. After the attack, the police force was disbanded and became a white-only police force. Another was a statue, as I mentioned, of Robert E. Lee, who had only set foot once or twice in New Orleans, and was invested in and built out to intimidate Black communities where it stood, where it actually was. And there were 2 others. And Mitch had wanted to take these down and replace them with something that spoke about civic inclusion. So he had done the work, he had got the public resources together, he got approval from the state, he got approval from the city. It wasn't a hugely noisy political thing until it was about to happen. And then somebody car bombed I don't know why the contractor had a Lamborghini, but he had a Lamborghini. And they car bombed his Lamborghini. And Mitch said, you know, this has now become a huge political thing. If I don't get this taken down the next few days, we're going to lose our capacity to do it because the state was passing different kind of legislation. And he just asked for quick help to contract with an outside firm, outside of the state firm, to come to the South and do that project. And it just wasn't something we knew a lot about as an institution. We weren't really involved in. When I asked our outstanding team, they pointed out that, well, in government, you have a lot of diplomatic security. Here, if people are getting security threats related to that, we can't protect our people or our foundation or anyone we might support. But in the end of the day, the team said, look, we really want to make it work. And so virtually overnight, we said yes. Mitch took those statues down. It led to a national conversation that was even accelerated after the tragic event in Charlottesville, Virginia, when they were also taking statues down there. And it led to a national conversation about symbols and inclusion. And it's Mitch Landrieu's big bet, not ours. But one of the things I get to do at the foundation is support others when they have that aspiration. And I'm glad we were able to make a difference in that setting.
Another snapshot for a big bet. You are in India, and you're meeting with the CEO of Tata, one of the greatest
Huge
Indian
company,
companies
yeah.
as well. And something that has been a particular passion of yours becomes something that is a major program of the Rockefeller Foundation. What happened?
Well, I had spent years working on poverty and development. That's really what the foundation has done for a long, long time, and it's what I've done for a while. And I've come to the conclusion, based on a lot of experience, but also a tremendous amount of data, that in fact, almost anybody, almost any community can lift themselves up and build a strong, inclusive economy where kids are hopeful about their future. But if they don't have access to basic infrastructure, and in particular, modern electricity and power, they basically are sentenced to live in extreme poverty and suffering. And we see this all around the world. There are about 1 billion people, about 800 million people who don't actually have access to enough electricity to power one light bulb and one small appliance per year in their homes. In those communities, there's another 2 billion on top of them whose average cost of power is somewhere around 60 to 70 cents a kilowatt hour because they're using diesel backup generators. And anyone who runs a business will tell you, you can't really succeed running a business at that price point for power. And so we systematically exclude about 2.5 to 3 billion people on Earth from economic growth, vitality, jobs, opportunities for women and girls, because we don't allow them to live in a modern energy infrastructure environment. And years before I arrived at Rockefeller, my predecessors created a program where they started tinkering with, and it really was tinkering with, solar panels and batteries. And David will remember these days. And they would go themselves on these little boats across a river to northern Bihar to install these systems. And their idea was very simple. It was, nobody has provided infrastructure to these folks. What if we take these new technologies, solar panels, batteries, smart meters that allow you to, find out who's using what power, mobile phone-based payments so people can pay without having to go through the electric utility, which is usually kind of corrupt or defunct in many of these places. What if we can just create a new innovative solution that would provide electricity to people, billions of people who don't have it? And it basically didn't work for about 7 or 8 years. And they just kept making it better and better. And then finally, they partnered with Tata Corporation, huge Indian company. And they got the price down from somewhere around $1.10 a kilowatt hour to about 15 to 18 cents a kilowatt hour with Tata's support. And at that price point, this became an incredibly efficient way to provide electricity to the hundreds of millions of people in India that didn't have it and therefore lived in poverty. So when I made my visit, I got to see one of these systems at work. And I walked through a village with my wife, Shivam, and our daughter, Amna, who came along. And it was amazing because we walked through this village and all of a sudden, everything shuts down. Everything goes dark. It's like 6 p.m. And you think, oh, everything's over. The power's out. That was it. They get 3 or 4 hours of government-supported power a day. And then thanks to what they all call the Rockefeller grid, the power went back up about a minute later. And people went back to work, and we went store by store, and we'd ask the shop owner, a carpentry guy, and say, well, what are you doing with this expanded access to electricity? He's like, oh, I bought power tools and I've hired these 4 people. Or we met a young woman who had a business sewing, and she's like, I bought electric sewing machines and I'm training these young girls to do this. We went to a school where, and this is unfortunate, but the way it is, the boys would study during the day, girls would study at night if there was light. And now there's steady, consistent light. And the schoolhouse was packed, room after room, with young girls there to study, who could then also walk home safely because there were streetlights out. And we said, gosh, this could be a transformational solution for the world. So this was a few years ago. Fast forward quickly, we built an alliance called the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. We've raised a few $1 billion of philanthropic capital, but actually just in the last few months, we've put together a pool of about $40 billion of multilateral development finance and some other sources of capital, and we're expanding access. Our goal is to reach 1 billion people with solar systems over the course of the next 6 years, holding hands with large financial institutions like the World Bank and the African Development Bank.
The power of partnership.
The
Wow.
power of partnership.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Wow. Look, I hope I'm not going too far in saying this, but under your leadership and with the board's support and David's encouragement, there's been a hard pivot of the Rockefeller Foundation as well into other programs that are addressing the root causes of what Bill and Joe's conversation this morning focused on, the endangerment to democracy. How do we preserve democracy? How do we encourage democratic movements, if you will, by dealing with some of the root causes? Yeah. Around the world, perhaps hunger is one of the critical ones. What's the foundation been doing most recently in terms of addressing hunger?
Well, maybe I'll answer that in a moment. I just want to say something about, since you mentioned Joe's comments earlier, I really appreciated the Q&A that he had where he said, gosh, now I'm attacked for being too right and then too left, right? And it's, I think, because in this country, and we see this, for families who basically have their economics defined by their assets, they're doing well. They're living in a good, robust, strong economy. And for families that have their livelihoods and their capacities defined by their income, they're actually, most of them are struggling and experiencing real struggle. And I think American democracy will only persist if our democratic institutions actually deliver for most American households. And so the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States is extremely committed to working in partnership with others to expand access to opportunity. We collaborate with this administration. Well, we collaborated with the Trump administration to build a testing infrastructure during the COVID crisis for the entire country. So we'll work with anybody. And I say that because I would personally negotiate with good people, but good people who are under instructions, not to expand testing, because if you did, you'd find more cases and that would be a problem. And so we do believe you work with anybody. Right now, we're working aggressively with the current administration and about 40 state and city leaders to accelerate the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Program. We created something called the Community Benefits Agreement. So if a company in the US is building a battery plant, now as part of a collaboration, but also an actual regulation with the DOE, that company has to go and do a survey of the local community, find out which parts of the community don't have access to employment, and make efforts to employ people from those communities in these new, often federally financed, or at least somewhat federally supported manufacturing facilities across the country. And I've visited our grantees that are helping to establish this in Louisiana and Los Angeles and Georgia. It makes a huge difference sitting there talking to workers who are like, look, I never had access to work. I used to commute 2 hours to go to LA to find service work. Now I'm part of a training program that the CBA, or the Community Benefits Agreement, has provided, and then I'll get a job that's going to pay $18 an hour helping to make electric buses as America reforms its public infrastructure fleet. So to me, Phil, your question's a great one, which is how do we reimagine, just applying it in the US, how do we reimagine access to opportunity in this country? And what are the practical, largely bipartisan things we can do that make a huge dent in that problem? And that's what I felt like someday I want to turn on Morning Joe and I want to hear, I know it's a little nerdy and a little wonky, but I want to hear about community benefits agreements. And I want to hear about, ideas that actually expand opportunity and not just the political bickering that we see on TV.
Yeah. Well, I guess I should go back and to another snapshot. The National Prayer Breakfast.
Yeah.
When you were head of USAID. I think it's fair to say that a preponderance of the participants in that each year are probably people of a Republican persuasion. There's a very strong evangelical participation. My wife and I have regularly participated in it. And they invited you, coming of a Hindu tradition, to be its speaker that one year. What did that experience tell you about what we all have in common and how we can somehow narrow these divides?
Well, I learned about the Congressional Prayer Group and the Senate Prayer Group after a kind of interesting moment when we lost the House in 2010. I was in the administration at the time. The new budget that they had proposed, the Republican budget, would have zeroed out USAID and eliminated my job. So I was heavily motivated to figure out how to avoid that outcome. And actually, I'd gone up to Congress and testified, and being kind of a data wonk, I said something like, "Well, this HR 1, this Republican budget, will end up killing 70,000 kids," and I laid it all out, and I was, thought I was accurate. Immunizations, malaria, shutting down HIV and maternal-to-child transmission programs for HIV/AIDS. And I got back to my desk, and our mutual friend Tom Vilsack called me and said, "Raj, I was just with Speaker Boehner." I got back to my desk. Actually, I was getting congratulatory phone calls from the White House because they were like, finally, somebody said something meaningful up there. And Tom called, and he said, "I was just with Speaker Boehner, and he was really upset about your comments. And he felt that he spent a lot of time nurturing a largely faith-based community of Republican support for you and for the humanitarian work the United States does around the world. And this makes it more difficult." And so I went up to see the speaker and apologized for my comments and said, "What can I do?" And his chief of staff, a guy named Barry Jackson, gave me a list of about 30 or 40 people to get to know. Most were very conservative evangelical members, and some became extremely good friends, including Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, who recently passed. And Senator Inhofe was the one who I think spearheaded my invitation to be the keynote speaker at the National Prayer Breakfast, and wanted me to deliver a speech about how it's in our interest as Americans, and it's in our core purpose that's embedded in the Declaration of Independence about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to live our moral values in our foreign policy and make investments that can address and end hunger, that can address and end extreme poverty, that can protect women and girls from the subjugation they live through in so many different parts of the world. And so I did, and it was extremely well received. And thankfully, they ended up, actually only 2 agencies got budget increases, not decreases. After that, it was NASA and USAID. And that happened because of the extraordinary bipartisan political support we built, spearheaded by leaders like Jim Inhofe, Johnny Isakson, like faith-based Republican leaders who stuck their neck out so we could do something special with extra resources in that window of time.
Just a reminder that if we're going to be preserving democracy, however fervent our views, however strong our convictions, listening to people of a different persuasion, of a different tradition, and finding what is correct in their observations creates the kinds of partnerships that gets a lot more done than simply trying to convince them all the time.
Well, Phil, I think that's very true. And I write in the book when I talk about the relationship with Senator Inhofe and the prayer breakfast experience and what that meant for America's ability to lead the world on all of these humanitarian efforts, especially around hunger in that window of time. Because there was a massive famine in the Horn of Africa and in Somalia in that moment as well. What I learned was actually, it wasn't even listening. You know, my instinct going in was, well, if I just got a chance to explain myself, you know, and if folks could see the data that I presented successfully to Bill Gates that made him support this crazy vaccine bond we issued that made all this impact, I just needed that moment. And it turns out I didn't need that moment. What I needed was the time to get to know them. You know, I needed to sit and hear Jim's story of why he adopted an Ethiopian girl, of why he cared so much about poverty in Africa, of what in his faith background drives his policymaking in a way that provides opportunities for partnership. And I'm using Jim as one example, but there were, 30 other people in that group. And I just find in politics, well, not just politics, in life, we're all running with our ideas and selling our ideas. And there it required not selling our ideas, it required listening to their values and understanding other people's values. And so my prescriptive lesson from that for today, because people ask me, oh, is that even possible today? Because it seems so crazy out there, is absolutely it's possible today. Our foundation takes groups of members of Congress, House and Senate, around the world on these study trips on issues related to our efforts. And you get folks away from their devices, away from their Twitter, away from the cameras, and away from the heat of political fundraising. And all of a sudden, people can talk about their families, their values, what binds us together. And those efforts have yielded real results, big investments in food as medicine in this country as a result of one of those engagements and retreats. So I see it's still possible. It's just not on television. What you see on TV is the far extremes. And what you don't see is there are people out there that are either good or can behave well, if encouraged by peer pressure and the moment. And we need a little bit more of bringing folks together based on our values and listen.
Amen. Amen. Before we entertain questions, what else amongst all the things the Rockefeller Foundation is doing today, what are you most excited about that you think may have as strong an opportunity to help preserve and expand democracy?
Well, we do a lot of work internationally on democracy, but that's not my answer. My answer is actually in the United States. I think we have built a network of, I mentioned 40 governors and mayors around the country that we call the Rockefeller Opportunity Collective. It actually grew out of something called opportunity zones that Tim Scott, a senator on the Republican side, had introduced years ago. And it's a network of people working on equity and opportunity in low-income communities across this country. And what I'm so hopeful about is you could be in a rural part of West Virginia, and I could watch one of our grantees kind of helping to transform a coal town into something that can attract or retain technology talent. Or I can go into the Central District of New Orleans, a very low-income African-American community, and see people dealing with the exact same challenges, lack of access to education, a drug crisis that's debilitating, kind of being ignored by the political system, not being invested in or listened to. And the solutions they come up with are often the same solutions. Educate people, get access to investment, community development. And to me, that listening to and serving those folks that feel left out, that's how we rebuild our democracy. That's how we protect the institutions that we rely on to take us into the future.
Good. Sean, I think we might have some questions. You're going to choose people?
Yeah, we'll go right up front
Good.
here. Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Phil. Thank you so much, Raj. So I heard a lot of amazing things about how we end poverty, how we end hunger, how we ensure health. And all of those things, thanks to your work and others, have been getting better. And I can see that trajectory, and I can see that future where nobody goes to bed hungry and everybody has electricity. What's getting worse, as we know, climate change is getting worse, even if the rate is slowing, potentially. Biodiversity is getting worse. What's happening in our oceans is getting worse. So imagining the second half of the 21st century, imagining a future in which we've capped the increase in temperature, in which biodiversity is recovering, species are recovering. What's your big bet on how we got there?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Can I just first, before I answer it, and I will try, I didn't want to appear that everything is rosy, because in fact, during COVID, we all know this, but in the United States and other wealthy countries, we spent about 30% of GDP propping up our economy, creating a safety net, supporting people, and loosen monetary policy considerably, as everyone knows. The result of in developing countries and even large emerging economies, the Brazils, Indias of the world, in the large emerging economies, about 6%. In 75 developing countries, it was 2%. And then after that, that same influx of capital created the inflation we all experience. For every 1 point of inflation we get in the United States, or interest rate increase you get in the US, you get about 3.5 times that in developing countries. So right now there are 40 to 45 countries teetering on the edge of a debt crisis. If you go to Kenya, there were riots in the streets because they can't pay their bills to subsidize fossil fuels for the diesel generators and the vehicles. They have no money, and 70 cents out of the dollar is owed to external debt. That's true in more than 40 countries right now. And it's so we are actually in a short-term window of moving backwards on a lot of the things. So I didn't want to say that it's all just rosy. The foundation actually has worked on a super innovative instrument to resolve that issue called special drawing rights through the International Monetary Fund, but that's a separate discussion. I don't know the answer to your question of how do we get to a place where we prevent the climate crisis from being debilitating to billions of people and to major ecosystems around the world. I know this because I get briefed by the scientists regularly on this. We've blown past every metric we thought in all the worst case scenarios. We've already blown past every one of them. Temperature increase, sea level rise, salinity in waters that we need for protein from fish in certain environments. There's more impact on food production than they expected this early. There's more erratic weather events than they expected this early in the consequence of the climate crisis. So it's worse than the worst models had predicted. Next year, we're going to put more emissions into the atmosphere. We are building out, as I speak about building solar, we're building 112 gigawatts of Chinese-financed coal, brand new, in about 30 countries around the world: Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, just you name it. And that's going to unwind almost the entire progress we've made as a globe of the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States. So, when you actually look at the numbers, I can't tell you that I know the path to just solve the climate crisis. I mean, everybody knows the technologies we need and the economic transformation we need, but how we get there, I don't know. A few of the things I'm most excited about, though. One is large-scale energy transformation. Like that is the core. And the sooner we can invest in large-scale shift from fossil fuels to renewables, which are now at a price point almost everywhere where they're either competitive or even better than the alternative, if we can eliminate diesel subsidies and fossil fuel subsidies and trillions of dollars we spend on that, we can actually bring justice and opportunity to lots of people that don't have it and accelerate the climate solution. The second is food system. The food system is the single biggest area where, in addition to reduced emissions, you can get large sequestration of carbon and other dangerous atmospheric emissions. And Susan's done a lot of work on this, but transforming our food system to both make us healthy and protect our planet is a huge priority for the foundation. And it will require changing the way food companies behave, which usually change when they're regulated differently. They don't just voluntarily change the way they behave. But our food system is the #1 cause of illness in the United States. It's soon to be the #1 cause of illness around the world. We spend $330 billion a year annually in this country treating diabetes, which is almost entirely a disease caused by what you eat, because our food system is so high in added fat, added sugar, and added sodium for so many people. And so, we're involved in a major effort called Food as Medicine. Our big bet in this country is food as medicine. And we're doing really extraordinary research across the country with the Veterans Affairs Administration and with Kaiser Permanente and with CMS, the Medicare and Medicaid system, to demonstrate that actually you can feed people in a way that reduces their hemoglobin A1C to moderate levels. And now, because Ozempic has become so popular, and companies are looking for ways to not spend $1,000 a month for everybody to get Ozempic, there's been a big influx of capital into those types of solutions. So we have to have a wholesale change in our energy system, a wholesale change in our food system, and ultimately a wholesale change in industrial manufacturing processes. There are some who believe the only way to get there is some form of carbon pricing. And as someone who studied economics for a while, I tend to believe that, but I don't see the immediate way to get there.
Raj, I want to offer just one friendly amendment before the next question. And I say this having spent 20 years on the boards of 3 international energy companies. Remember Mike Nichols' movie, The Graduate? And you remember when,
Plastics.
plastics. If Mike Nichols were doing the film today, the answer wouldn't be plastics, it would be batteries.
Yeah.
Energy storage advances will be absolutely critical to achieve the view that you have. And we're almost in prehistoric stages of what can be done in energy storage. And I would argue that that is a friendly amendment that will be essential as well. Other questions, Sean?
Right. Thanks for being here. Thanks for this discussion and for the unique perspective that you both bring to the theme of this Summer Institute. My question is for both of you. We all find ourselves today on the campus of this amazing college with its amazing mission. My initial iteration was going to be to ask you what wisdom you might have to impart, but I think a better question is what hopes do you have both for and from the next generation that are soon going to be inhabiting this campus and campuses around the country?
I have no wisdom to share, but I will share the wisdom that was recently imparted to me in that. I went to a reception 2 weeks ago for Sylvia, the new president of this college. And she talked with great eloquence to the small group of us about the future that she envisions for this institution. And I went up to her afterwards and said, I have no real standing to say this, but just living in this community, I think the emphasis on human ecology is critical, but I come from a background and a belief in the trivium and the quadrivium as the basis of liberal arts education. And I hope that the students here will have as much focus, if you will, on some of the classical issues of education in the liberal arts. And she interrupted me and she said, exactly. What we need to be doing as an example is do a program, and I hope you don't mind, Sylvia, my saying this, doing a program on COVID, studying the science of what was the political activity that influenced public opinion about it, to get into how it had international consequences. But we need to have the students reading Camus' The Plague, so they understand the philosophical and spiritual impact, if you will, of human ecology. So I have no wisdom to say, other than I think we're damn lucky to have this new president.
All I would add is, as part of my book tour, I had a chance to visit probably 25 college campuses across the country, including community college campuses, some high schools, Harlem Village Academy, almost, charter school with almost all minority kids, first generation, low income. And the one thing that's been consistent across whether you're in the most elite setting or some of the more challenged settings is young people want to be problem solvers. Like they really don't have the patience. They don't believe fundamentally that, and I don't want to sound like I'm discounting what I do think is the most consequential election in our history right now, but they don't actually believe in their hearts, I think, that, your vote is the only vehicle you have to solve climate change or to change the nature of inclusion and respect and civility in your community or whatever it is you're passionate about. And they're looking for other ways to engage. And so I came away super excited that, they're just not cynical yet. And I was encouraged by that.
You said something prompting a comment that I have to offer as well. So often said this is the most consequential election in American history. Well, sometime it will be.
Yeah.
And in the context of this morning's session, I say this as somebody who thinks Barack Obama was a great president and Mitt Romney would have been a fine president, probably. But sometime a presidential election will be the most consequential election in American history, and I'll leave it at that.
Hi, my name is Joan Claybrook, and I have a nephew who came out of the Peace Corps. Excuse me, he was in Africa, in Malawi, Africa, and he's an engineer and a lawyer, and he was a teacher, and he realized that the biggest problem that they had in this community, this town, was they had no light at night. And so the young girls could not stay at school because it was not safe to go home. They had no light for cooking. And so he decided to build, when he came back to the United States, a nonprofit called Village X. And Village X has gone into solar power. And its idea is to have a solar power center in each community that everyone in the community can use, and it's all chained up so no one can take it away, and they can come and use it, and anyone for a penny or two can recharge their cell phones, and they have light and they have communication, and businesses have increased. And I'm just wondering if you're aware of this happening in Africa and whether there's something that the foundation might be interested in learning more about.
Yeah, I just thank you so much for that comment and for that question. And gosh, I wish I got that everywhere I went. I am aware of that. I'd love to learn a little bit more about Village X specifically. The reality is Malawi is going to be, so we've worked very closely with Malawi, as we have with probably 20 other African countries, to redesign their energy system. And Malawi, and currently we're in the process with our partners of acquiring for Malawi enough long duration battery storage to cover about 20% of their total grid capacity, which will overnight make every single new investment much, much, much cheaper if it's wind or solar relative to diesel turbines or fossil fuels of any kind. And so I'm very, very hopeful that Malawi, Zambia, and a few other countries in that region rapidly roll out coverage for millions and millions of people as part of this effort that we call Mission 300 to reach 300 million Africans by 2030. And it's all based, as Phil said just 30 seconds ago, on battery storage on the grid in Malawi. So it's fantastic. And by the way, when you go and you meet with the entrepreneurs on the other end of that, they all totally get it. They see how their lives have changed. They talk about it. They know that they're going to have opportunity. They're creating businesses, they're expanding businesses, and it's making a big difference already. So thank you for mentioning that. I'd love to learn more about Village X. We have a team on the ground in Lilongwe, and we've been working on Malawi for a long time.
Bill, I think it's my turn. And going back to your opening statement, you said something about democracies thrive when the people are served, something to that effect. And In 97 days, we're going to have an election here in this country. And if we use the last couple elections and look at the popular vote, some 70 million people seemingly don't feel like they are being served. So I leave that as you start answering some of these questions right towards the end of the presentation, but I'd love for you to go back and talk about some explicit examples of how we get to those people. And to a certain extent, are both sides of the aisle, if you will, making the right offer?
So, well, first of all, when Joe was speaking earlier, he said, well, look at the districts or the counties that voted for Obama in 2012 and Trump in 2016. And actually in 2017, we did exactly that. And we mapped all those counties, looked at them across this country. They are, of course, where you sort of expect, across the industrial Midwest, across large parts of the Sun Belt South, into communities in the West, but not the coast. And almost universally across those counties, there were sort of two things that we saw. This was back in 2017, 2018. One was a genuine, meaningful, dramatic decline in economic opportunity. Like you can just see, like, unemployment is super low, except in these counties. Jobs are accessible everywhere, except in these counties. The other was a drug abuse challenge that was really, those were the hotspots for a fentanyl crisis, for a heroin crisis, and for a drug abuse crisis. And so we worked on both those issues, with philanthropic partners and this community solutions effort. It's why we supported a coal to tech transformation in West Virginia. It's why, we did all of that with nonprofit partners. So it's not a political answer. But to me, the right political message should be going to those places and constructing and listening and putting authentic solutions on the table. So, we're in the midst of a huge drug crisis in this country, where the solution is either don't talk about it, or it's all somehow related to immigrants, which it's not. And I don't know, you'd have to really make a huge stretch to make those causal links possible, but they happen every day at large rallies. And the reality is our foundation's partnered with Stan McChrystal, a former general in the United States military, who's built a network of partners in these particular counties to coordinate better services for families affected by drug abuse and opioids and fentanyl. And that's making a big difference in those communities. We're not a political entity, so we don't go out there and run TV ads and host big rallies and do all that. But we do need our politics to connect to actual solutions in those places. And I would argue right now, neither political party has a public narrative that does that in a way that I think people believe or buy. And, I'm not a politician, but but my advice would be maybe a little less trying to win the election just by saying the other person is bad, and much more kind of acknowledging that these are real challenges communities face. And there are great solutions that are often, you don't even know, is Stan McChrystal Republican or Democrat? I mean, I think people know that, but you wouldn't really know by just working together. And that's the whole point.
I'll offer a comment too. Probably majority of Americans live lives today that are healthier, with more opportunity, certainly broader sense of what's going on in the rest of the world than even David's great-grandfather personally experienced. We are just so privileged to be living at this time in this country. And yet I say this as a product of the phenomenon. Meritocracy has led to an aristocracy in this country. And there is a profound sense of, I use your term, those people, that perhaps we think we have special privileges, and we probably do. And so how we preserve the fabric of American society, while we also extend the privileges, is going to be the real challenge. And I think what you said, listening and showing respect, is just really critical but it's not going to be done overnight and probably not going to be done by election day.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Raj. I feel like we could talk for 3 more hours. This was absolutely fascinating. I'd like to remind everyone that the Summer Institute bookstore is selling all of these books, so please make your way over there and get your book. And do come back tonight. We'll have Cuban-American poet Richard Blanco in conversation with Meg Weston. I look forward to seeing you then.